You want some great coffee to bring to your coffee hour for after liturgy? Or how about just to drink every morning on your own? When I do drink coffee, this is the only brand I drink, Fox & Sons Coffee. They believe over there, my man Stephen Fox believes that coffee should come with a great story. His began on Saturday mornings with his dad, early breakfasts, good conversation, and a shared cup of coffee that sparked a lifelong passion. Those memories shaped who he is and inspired him to start this company, Fox & Sons Coffee, not just for the love of the coffee itself, but to honor his father and pass something meaningful to his two sons. Now, he's inviting you and me to be part of that legacy. If you guys need gifts, if you just love coffee, and like I said, maybe you just want to bring some to the parish for coffee hour, now is the perfect time to try these handcrafted, family-inspired blends. We've got a code for you, BUCK15 at checkout, BUCK 15 at checkout, get you 15% off all orders over $35, so you can save big and sip better coffee than you may be used to. This coffee, again, is made with love, roasted with purpose, shared with family. Fox & Sons Coffee, brewed from the heart.
This is a Dissident Media production. DissidentMedia.net.
You're tuned into the Counterflow Podcast, home of dissident voices,
unapproved opinions.
But you gotta get ready.
You ready?
Now here's your host
and humble narrator,
Buck Johnson. Let's go.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I'm your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas. Our friend Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell is back on the show with us. Last time he was on, we talked about the Ortho Bros, and he did mention that his new book was called Christ as Truth, Truth as Christ. Why the ancients chose Christ, why we must also. That had just been basically released, and now I've got a copy of it. We're talking today about the themes within this book. I'll read you one of the descriptions. Not all religions respect the truth. Christ as Truth contrasts Christianity with three of them, Judaism, Buddhism, and Islam. It also explains why the early church was so insistent in council after council that Christ was both fully God and fully man. And no, it wasn't to pay the debt of our sins. So I think just that should interest you guys. I'm happy to have him back. We're talking about nihilism, truth, Christ, Buddhism, Islamism, Judaism, all of these things. It's a good conversation, and I think you're going to gain a lot from this, as I did myself. Without further ado, Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell, welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah. Last time we had you on, you had just released this book, as I'm showing the people right now, Christ as Truth, Truth as
Right.
Christ. In fact, I think that was so new. When I saw you a week later, you still didn't even have many copies of it. I was happy to get this through Amazon in the mail. And you said, out of all the books I've written, this is the one that I say, everyone should read this. I don't say that about any other ones, but everyone should read this. Having read it, I would second that motion. It's why I wanted to... I would second that notion. I'm not in a meeting. It's why I wanted to have you on and talk about these topics, because it's very important. We live in an age that has separated itself largely, I think, from truth. So we're going to get into all of that. I've had you on before. You don't have to give a deep, long intro on yourself if you don't want, but people do find this show, and algorithms and whatnot. So for those who don't know who you are, I'll let you do that, and then we'll dive in.
Okay. Well, I'm a retired writer. I was a speechwriter for many years. Before that, I was a journalist. I was the Washington bureau chief for Investors Business Daily here in town in D.C., Washington, D.C. And I wrote mainly about foreign policy. And the book was in a sense inspired by what I saw about how foreign policy is made in this town and all the various interests that come into play and the cases they make for themselves, and which are oftentimes plainly dishonest cases. And before that, I was a journalist elsewhere, worked a little bit in corporate communications. I was a soldier for 7 years. And in fact, it was when I was a soldier that I was clued into the existence of the Orthodox Church by being stationed in Turkey in the army in 1940 or 85 and 86. All these Byzantine ruins there, you can't miss them. They're everywhere by the side of the road in town and whatnot. And some of them were quite beautiful. And so when I got back to the States, I started looking for that beauty, that kind of church. And it wasn't long before I found several here in Washington, D.C., and was quickly sold on the issue, not just for the beauty, but the antiquity, also the history, also the depth of theology and philosophy and its way of life, the things that it preserved from the early church that so many other churches had just sort of thrown away. I grew up in a church, a Christian tradition, the Church of Christ. It's a very American church, and sometimes called Campbellites. Being originally from Nashville, Tennessee, well, they had one of their universities there, David Lipscomb University. Two of my sisters went there. And there were a lot of things I liked about that tradition. They were like half Orthodox. They baptized by immersion and sang a cappella at communion every week, and were pretty serious about what it meant. It meant communion with God, one way or another. And then also working at your salvation in fear and trembling. That was all very Orthodox. What they didn't have was a history or really any structure or clergy other than a preacher that you hired to preach, and no calendar and no feasts and all the other things. They went with only what was in the New Testament, and they left out a lot that was well done by the New Testament, but not in evidence actually in writing in the New Testament. And so I was always wanting more, and so I became more Orthodox through that, searching for more. And also, of course, the fact that the church is more faithful to, the Orthodox Church is more faithful to what the Father has taught about male and female, which has always been a big issue with me. My first book was about women in the military, published in 89. And that's when I got out of the Army, I became a journalist and wrote this first book. And I was already seeing the obvious problems that we see now, which weren't so obvious back then. They were to some people paying attention, but we're only now seeing the culmination of what George Gilder, the best-selling author named George Gilder, called sexual suicide, which was the title of one of his books in the early 70s, which I read in college in the late 70s. And of course, when it comes to male and female, right now we're seeing a great awakening, actually, of the dangers of feminization. One of our parishioners here at the cathedral, Helen Andrews, has been giving talks about the great feminization. It's gotten an amazing amount of attention. I think it's something that some of us have been talking about for a long time, but it has now just come to a head, and people are willing to hear it. They realized, there is something to this, and it explains an awful lot about the situation we're in with wokeness in general and the general trend in our society there. Very timely now, and amazingly, my life's work has been about male and female, and besides that, actually 2 books on women in the military, because I redid the first one, expanded it later on in the late 90s. Also, I've written a book about, also in the 90s, I wrote a book called Scandal of Gender, which was a survey of early Christian teaching from the fathers on male and female. And then also my master's thesis has been published as The Disappearing Deaconess, looking at that issue there and what it meant, putting it in the context of what the church taught. Since I'd already done this book on what the church was teaching in the early centuries, it was easy for me to then analyze the historical evidence of deaconesses based upon what I knew that they taught, and then also look at the evolution of the offices within the church. And then that's my master's thesis. My doctoral thesis was also, or dissertation. In Europe, they call them doctoral theses. But it was also published recently in 2021, and it's on the Greek and Hebrew roots of Christian thinking on male and female. And that, in fact, is its subtitle. The full title is Origen's Revenge, the Greek Hebrew Roots. And that does trace the influence of Greek thinking, Hebrew thinking of male and female, which are very different. One very anti-sexual, one very pro-sexual, and how those feed into Christian thinking, which does actually give us two traditions. And those two traditions have been at odds with each other for a long time. That's why Origen was condemned. That's why at least several of his writings were condemned. That's why many of his teachings were condemned. And some others were condemned, like Evagrius Ponticus, Didymus the Blind. And yet it still survives in the thinking of some fathers, notably Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus the Confessor. And that's what Origen's Revenge looks at. It looks at that presence and how to reconcile it or not reconcile it. Truly, I don't think you can reconcile it with everything else in the tradition. And so that's what I've been talking about since then, mainly. I have done a bit of writing on our foreign policy when I was working for the paper. I've also written about banking policy as a member of a group called the Academy of Philosophy and Letters. Besides that, I have recently also written and talked about church-state relations, being a reporter here in town, writing about politics, and comparing sort of the Orthodox understanding of politics with church-state relations with that of the West. They're actually very different, and this is not something that even a lot of Orthodox really understand. And so that's one thing that I've gotten into a little bit, talked about, and published a little bit on. Mainly my issues have been male and female, although in this book, and of course, I don't expect those other books are the books that I wouldn't say everybody needs to go out and read. Oh, by the way, I did write one book too on political theory, and it was also while I was working for the paper here in town. And it was descriptive political theory. It didn't tell you what to believe. It just told you this is why other people believe what they do and why they make alliances with other people, how close they are to the various persons around the world. The book is called 8 Ways to Run the Country. The theory is still quite valid, although the faces and names have largely changed since that book was published 20 years ago. I toy with the idea of redoing it, but haven't got around to it. It didn't attract a lot of attention at first because it doesn't sell anybody's case. I mean, it doesn't say this is what you should believe and they're going to win. And marketers didn't know what to do with it. They want a screed from the left or a screed from the right. And this is not a screed, it's an analysis. And it has actually received some attention academically. It's been used to teach politics at Yale, also at Catholic University of America. And so that's also part of my background. That sort of explains why I was writing about church-state relations and whatnot. But this book, the new one, Christ as Truth, Truth as Christ, I wrote for my own children when they were in high school, so that when they went away to college, they wouldn't lose their faith. And it's basically the most compelling case I could craft for believing in Christ. And it comes out of what I saw as a politician or as a reporter, political writer here in town, and how fundamentally dishonest a lot of people are in the political business, and how much of politics is about avoiding the truth rather than admitting it, confessing it, living accordingly. And that I saw was a large part of the motivation there. People just didn't feel an obligation to tell the truth or admit the truth. They could easily just shrug and just go along with the flow. And what are you going to do? And in fact, that's where the book begins. I was giving a talk online, a cable show by a well-known commentator here in town 25 years ago. And we were talking before the show was taped. We were having our makeup done in the makeup room. And he was very knowledgeable. He'd obviously read parts of the book at least and seemed to agree with everything I said. But at one point he did literally shrug and say, well, what are you going to do? And my thought was, well, you could tell the truth about this. And that just didn't seem to occur to him at the time. And I didn't say it that bluntly. It was, it was kind of eye-opening to see how casually people treat the truth. And I've always been of the mind that if you want to talk about, what's politically possible, because that's a real killer in this town. It's like there are a lot of good ideas that just get dismissed because people assume, well, that's not politically possible. Well, until you're actually speaking the truth about an issue, of course, nothing is politically possible because the lies will win. You have to speak the truth, get people used to hearing the truth, and then they'll get used to believing it, and that makes a lot of other things politically possible. So, but beyond that, it's not really a political book. It does relate faith to politics, but it's really more about just what the issue all of us face, which is the question of what do we live for? What makes sense of right and wrong? What makes sense of what's true and lies? And why should we pay attention to the truth? Why should we suffer for it and maybe even die for it? Not just the truth, but the truth of what is good for all mankind. And that's what people don't want to commit to. And yet that's what the cross of Christ is all about. That's what Christ does. He lives, suffers, dies, gives his life for the sake of the world. That's what he does. We have a loving God who's willing to do that for us. And we're called to follow his example. And that's the book in a nutshell. So.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about this, the truth is a person. Before coming to Orthodoxy, I had never heard that before. And it's still to this day something I sort of not grapple with necessarily, but try to work through like the implications of what that really means. And your book helped with that, by the way. And so I sort of want to start with that because I think that's key. We say the truth is not a concept, it's a person. Certainly, it's not subjective, which I think a lot of people, even something that you just said, why people should understand and speak truth. I can already hear pushback from pop culture people that I know in my life going, well, to you, that's the truth, but I have a different truth. That's sort of been the spirit of the last 10 years of experiences and discussions I've had with people. So talk about the impact of the truth is a person and the implications that has from that starting point.
Well, I define truth in the first chapter of the book. I give it a pretty, what I think is a simple definition. There's been a lot written on this, and I've never found a definition that really works, I think, as well as this one does for me, at least. And that's that truth is an objective reality we are obliged to respect. Meaning, first of all, it's reality. It's what is. Second of all, it's objective, meaning it's not us. And so, we don't make the truth. We don't make this reality. It's something we're presented with and we have to deal with. And we're obliged to respect it. And it's that part that really causes a lot of people trouble. Because there are people who believe in objective reality. They believe that some things are absolutely true. The sun rises in the morning. They're convinced of a lot of scientific things based upon their own observation or what others have proved and whatnot. And they'll agree those things are all true. But when it comes to actually, living accordingly, then they stumble. Right now, the most obvious denial of objective reality is the distinction of male and female. We have people saying, no, don't believe your eyes, don't believe the science. There's really no such, it's all just a construct and you can be whatever you want to be. And a plain denial of the truth there. But of course, ultimately, the objective reality is a person or persons in our religion. And of course, that's deeply meaningful in itself. And the distinction of several persons within God is, or the Trinity, the Godhead, you might say, that's very a key part of some of my other writings having to do with male and female, because I do rate the image of God. I do relate the image of God to the difference of male and female in a very different way, which has a patristic basis, as an aside. But even if you're not don't bring into question the idea of the multiple persons, you still have the question of what's the objective reality and why should we respect it? And that's where other religions kind of don't provide you with that. They don't provide you with a personal reality that's actually that you have to relate to, that cares for you and that shows you the way and rewards you when you follow the way, when you tell the truth, when you live by truth, when you do what's right and good for all mankind, for all others is what it's all about. Because the natural tendency is for people to fall into just doing what's right and good for their kind,
Yes.
Me and mine, my family, my tribe, my corporation, my country, my nation, some people, my church, but, the various forms of tribes that we form, and we make that our objective reality, which is actually puts the tribe in the place of God. Or if it's just ourselves, we're putting ourselves in the place of God. objective, that personal objective reality that we really use, that it is really the basis of right and wrong for us, what is true and what is not true. And that's what we see quite a lot of. And that's what really moved me to analyze belief in Christ from that standpoint. Going back, really, I started with the Old Testament, reading it through in terms of this idea of living according to a real God who is really true, and how distinguished that is, how the opposite of that is living for the tribe, me and mine. And that's the mistake that a lot of people do when they read the Old Testament. They get a tribal message out of it, the people of Israel, whatnot. And in fact, that's the Jewish way of reading the Old Testament. And they're thinking in terms of the tribe as being this certain people, whereas the Christian way of reading it is to say, no, the tribe is those of faith who believe as Israel does, trust God, and do what is right, which comes to making peace with your brothers, and how to do that, and living according to truth. And anybody can live that way. Anybody can share that faith. And that's what we're all called to do. That's the ultimate truth about truth, and the truth about truth that we're all called to bear witness to. And the book goes into that. It has a chapter on the Old Testament. It tells the story of Jacob's selection, why he is the Israel of God, and why the children of God are called the children of Israel. It's because he's the first one who really does the really good thing, the really exceptionally good thing, which is make peace with his brother Esau by risking all that he has to do that. In the Beatitudes, when we say blessed are the peacemakers, what it means is those who are indeed willing to confess their offenses to their brothers and do everything possible to reconcile with their brothers. And then the flip side of that is those who are also willing to forgive their brothers for offenses against them. And that we see in Joseph. So in Jacob and Joseph, we have the two best things done by anybody in the Old Testament. Of course, you get to the New Testament, and then you're seeing an even greater example in our Lord himself. But that's the approach I take to it. A different way of reading the Old Testament, but reading it essentially the Christian way, which leads you to the incarnation, and then the effect that has on the Christian church and on the world as a result of the Christian witness, the Christian dedication to truth. It's really a lot of the great causes that people now celebrate. They may not be causes that are the best causes, but a large part of the activists behind these causes have this idea that it's a good thing to give of yourself for what is right. And they're willing to suffer for it. And sometimes they're willing to die for it. And that in a sense owes something to the Christian gospel, because that's what Christians have taught, the way that Christians have taught the world to think. Don't just live for yourself, live for others. And that's what Christ does. He lives and he dies for us, but he's resurrected. And of course, promises us that resurrection. And of course, that makes the compelling case for actually believing in Christ as well.
As you guys know, the team at Podsworth Media has worked with me for a long time producing this show. A big part of that over the past couple of years has been them using their Podsworth app to make the audio sound clean, level, professional, even when the raw recordings were super sketchy, which mine can be sometimes. In fact, this one that you're listening to right now is super sketchy. I took this microphone sock off here just to show you how crappy it will sound. Except when they put it through the Podsworth app, it sounds beautiful. I've got this annoying white noise maker going on. It's driving me crazy. If you want to hear how bad this recording is before they put it through the Podsworth app, you can hear the full before and after demo for yourself at the link in the description. The app recently got a huge update, and it's better than ever. So good, in fact, that it can take almost any atrocious voice recordings and make it sound great. They remove background noise. It cuts down on plosives. It fixes clipping when your gain is too high. It reduces reverb, removes clicks, pops, improves tone, and the level of the dialogue is even and consistent. So if I move around like this, which I sometimes do when I get excited, it'll fix all of that. It's super simple. Go to podsworth.com, click Get Started. Drag and drop your audio files or open them right from your smartphone browser. Customize your settings if you want, but honestly, the default works great for most podcast recordings. Here's the cool part. Enter code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. No account needed, just email and payment. Then you get the download link in your inbox with your cleaned up files. It's perfect for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, homilies, audiobooks, anything like that you want to sound legitimate and professional. Remember, use code BUCK50 for half off your first order. And you're supporting this show. Thank you, guys. Yeah, I was speaking this past weekend to a convert from evangelical Protestantism to Orthodox Christianity at my parish, sort of getting his backstory. And I said, when you first went to your first liturgy, were you sort of taken aback or freaked out, if you will, by certain things? And he said, yeah, naturally, as you hear a lot, the icons sort of freaked me out. Like, why are these pictures all over the place? Some of the, even the censing and the incense and things of that nature freaked him out. And then he said it hit him an hour or two into it, or maybe even after he left. This is not about me. Why am I making this about me? Is this true? And if it is true, then it doesn't matter what I think. And I said, man, I've heard a lot of convert stories. That's one of the most respectable amounts of humility I've heard from someone first seeing their first liturgy. So kudos to him. And I also want to say, you relate faith to truth in this book quite beautifully. And again, people, trying to maybe literally play devil's advocate, oftentimes people have trouble with the faith part of Christianity. And even as you laid it out, I could hear someone going, well, I get what he's saying, that Christ is truth and that we have to live for others as Christ did and taught us, but you still need faith. So how is that true?
Right. Yeah, that's I do. That's actually a key to the book, and actually the last part of the book I wrote because I realized I needed to make that case up front, or otherwise you wouldn't be able to follow where I'm going. I talk about early on. I talk about that how we know the truth. And I talk about we have our experience. And again, this is not an exhaustive explanation of epistemology. This is meant for teenagers, thoughtful young adults. But I talk about we have our experience and we have our attempts through reason to make sense of that experience. Of course, neither of these is really reliable for various reasons. I won't go into. A lot of them are pretty obvious, but you can't always trust your experience, trust your memory of it, or your experience of it. And you also can't trust your reasoning about it. You just might be wrong about the logic, or you might, your reason might be compromised by some other interest you have, which have you tending in a certain direction. And I write about how what's missing in that is ultimately faith, because faith is, in a sense, that sincere desire for what is true, for that's not just you. It is, and unfortunately, faith as it is depicted, or as it's come down to us, as most Westerners tend to think about, they're thinking from the Western tradition, which effectively reduced faith to a matter of simple cognition, what you believe, apart from anything you do. And part of this comes out of Augustine's comments, St. Augustine's comments on his own choice to believe without being able to prove it logically. He's coming out of philosophy, Neoplatonism, and he's going to become a Christian, and he can't prove the truth of Christianity. So he just writes about realizing that, you can't prove the truth of a lot of things we believe, but they still make sense, and so you believe them. There's nothing wrong with what he says, except that Westerners take from that this idea that faith is a matter of simply accepting what Christians say, accepting what the church dictates, which becomes sort of the way they approach it, they think about it, but also a real problem for people when they start rejecting the church in the Reformation and then rejecting Christianity in the Enlightenment. And because they believe that faith is simply a matter of passively accepting something, and oftentimes meaning being obedient to it. You have to submit to church authority, or you have to submit to Christianity. Then their idea of faith is just whittled down to this wishful thinking, wishful or willful thinking, where you just say, it's just something that is actually contrary to reason, that would believe, contrary to experience, contrary to reason, but you just have to accept it. And that's how it's often been thought of through the 19th century, into the 20th century even, that it's just something a nice story we tell ourselves, we choose because it works for us in some way or another. Whereas that's really not how to understand faith. Faith is actually it does arise out of this desire for what is good. But that desire, first of all, means a recognition that the source of what is good is outside ourselves. It's not us. So there, right away, you're talking about believing in something beyond yourself, that objective reality. And then, of course, you've got to also be a person of goodwill, so that you don't allow your animosities towards others to affect your regard for that objective reality, what is really true there. And I liken that, in a sense, these two elements of faith, in a sense, to the two great commandments. Our Lord is asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy soul and all thy mind. And then he immediately says, and the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. When that first great commandment, you have the idea of just admitting that you yourself, you have to be humble enough to admit that you yourself are not the basis of what is right and wrong, that is something outside yourself, and you've got to be open to it, humble enough to be open to really what is truly good for all. And that's the first great commandment, loving the Lord thy God. He's the objective reality we are obliged to respect. And then the second is, of course, loving your neighbor as yourself. And that's that expression of goodwill, that indeed you are interested in what's good for all, and you're not putting yourself over things. And so this humility and also goodwill are essentially the response of the heart to reality and ultimately to God. And that's what really is the basis of our faith, which is our response to the grace of God. All the good things we've gotten. It's not just the sacraments. That's not the only way that God sheds his grace on us. For every good and perfect thing cometh down from above, from the Father of lights. Epistle of James. All good things come from God, and our response to that is the proper response is the response of faith, which is to welcome it, to thank God for it, and to live accordingly, which is to love God and to love our neighbor. And that's sets it up a little differently. That it's not just a matter of works. It's not a matter of earning your way to heaven, making the cut for heaven. It's a response to goodness itself, which is ultimately personal, but is also a matter of not just divine persons, but human persons, and how we love both, actually.
Well, that would lead me to ask about the term love. It feels, again, in our age of subjectivism, that's taken on an incorrect meaning very often. I could give story after story, example after example. I think everyone listening probably has their own, so I don't need to. Talk about the, let's say, misuse of love versus Christ-like love.
Well, that's part of the problem. And actually, I start the book off with this issue of love and truth, because there are a lot of people who would think that, well, if you love people, you don't dare tell them the truth because that hurt. The truth hurts, and so you don't tell them the truth. And yet, my response is, well, you can't love people with lies and trick them into truth. The truth is what is good for them ultimately, and so that's what you've got to give them if you want what's good for them. Of course, we often struggle with what truth to give people and how much truth to give people, how much can they understand, and then how to present it. And these are things that fallible human beings will always struggle with. Our Lord didn't have this problem. He was omniscient. He knew exactly what to say. And yet even he couldn't just talk everybody into believing it and accepting it. He could tell them the truth, knowing that no matter what he told them, they weren't going to believe him. They had other interests that were going to trump any concern for what is really true for everybody, the objective reality, because their own reality was their own flesh and blood, me and mine, as they use the phrase in the book. They were concerned about keeping the tribe together, and their own position. Pilate is concerned about his career and keeping his head on his shoulder. And I talk about the history of that, the situation, the political situation that Pontius Pilate was in, which is the reason why it's like, well, the indication is he obviously didn't think that Jesus was as guilty and deserving punishment.
Right.
Nevertheless, he goes along with it. Because
Yeah.
what are you going to do? That's the political answer. What are you going to do? And that's what he does. So everybody who's resistant to the truth is responding that way instead of responding with a sincere desire for what is good and true for all, recognizing that the basis of that is something outside themselves. So, what's your question? Love.
Yeah, love. Yeah.
Love. The problem with that is that, love has come down just to so weak and to just being nice to people. And
Yes.
we've gotten so far away from this idea that, there's a truth that people really need to live by. And yet, of course, I do argue in other books, and in a lot of talking I've been doing later about love itself coming in two different forms. And one is the self-giving form, where you give of yourselves for others. And the other is the thanksgiving that is a response to that. And we see this actually in the Father and the Son, because if you look at what we're told about the Father and the Son by our Lord himself in the Gospels, if you look at how they relate to each other, all the giving is done by the Father and all the thanking is done by the Son. Not once as it says that the Father thanks the Son, not once as it said that the Son gives anything to the Father except thanks. And this is also the relationship of parents and children, where it's the parents who do everything for the children, giving them. And it's not just doing things for them like a servant, but also sharing with them the truth they know and impressing upon them their own sense of meaning and purpose and direction. And so they really are giving of that part of themselves to their children. And the children are to respond thankfully. It's also, I argue, the relationship that St. Paul describes between the man and the woman. Mm-hmm. That indeed the man is to love his wife as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. And the woman is to respond with thankful service as the response. Having in a sense received her being from the man, and also being taken care of by the man after the fall, and then she responds thankfully, taking the Christ, because Christ does both of these things. To the Father he's thanksgiving, but to us he's self-giving, mm-hmm. And the woman too. The man, of course, we're thanksgiving towards God, but self-giving towards the woman and to our children. The woman is thanksgiving towards God and her husband, but self-giving towards her children. And so we both model, we both, men and women, have an opportunity to express these different forms of love. But that's not the kind of love that stands in the way of truth or that has been made the enemy of truth. That kind of love is just the idea of being nice to people, which generally means letting them do what they want, because that's the modern way. It's the Rousseauian notion of man was born free, but is everywhere in chains. And so what we need to do is free the person to do whatever the person wants, which ultimately in our own days means letting them pick whether they want to be a boy, girl, or anything between, and then forcing everybody else to go along with that, which is a gross perversion of the whole idea of love. But that's the state we're in.
Yeah. The perversion of the definition of love. And then, of course, the subjectivity of my truth sort of business that, it's like this book's an answer to all of that. The 5 enemies of truth are listed in here, and it's Gnosticism, Romanticism, Anarchism, Nihilism, and Tribalism. I could do multiple episodes on every single one of those. So when we go over them, we don't have to, break down for an hour Gnosticism. And I have done some episodes on these things. And I think Gnosticism now has found itself more discussed, I would say, than it used to for in my circles at least. But we'll start with that one. Why is Gnosticism the enemy of truth? And sort of how we're seeing Gnosticism manifest currently in our culture.
Yeah, the Gnostic is an ancient term which Christians like Clement of Alexandria actually apply to themselves. We're Gnostics in that we have a knowledge that is given to us by God. But its modern usage is indeed modern, and that was applied to certain Christian sects, which sort of imagined things that are not in the Christian Gospels, that are not inherited by, they're not traditional, they're not revealed to us, but they would make up these stories, and then they'd sell people on the story, and people would just choose to go along. A lot of times because of the appeal that, this is more exciting than mundane life. And this is beneficial to you because it makes you part of the knowing ones. You can be in the in crowd, the people who really know things. And so there's this element of vanity, superiority, because all the Gnostic sects had different levels that, you could attain. You can feel yourself really special for belonging to it. But the core of it is that you're really not concerned about what's true. You're just picking something to believe in. And it really is sort of wishful thinking at that point, willful thinking. Whatever you pick is just, well, that works for you because it makes you feel special. It gives you friends, makes you part of the cult. And of course, that's what cults are based on, real cults. But then, and we recognize those real cults where you can't talk to people because they're just so into it that you can't, you're just not amenable to reason. But that's also true with a lot of other choices we make about things. A lot of times we just don't want to bother to sort out a difficult issue, so we'll accept an easy answer. And that works for them because that means they don't have to think more about things. And of course, a lot of times avoid the inconveniences of actually living by what is actually true, both the difficulty of figuring it out and then the inconvenience of having to live accordingly. Gnosticism gets you out of that. You just pick what you want to believe, and if it works for you, that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm. There's elements. I don't want any attacks from people listening. I've been in and around the conspiracy world for 25 years. Obviously, conspiracies are very real. We've seen a lot of them manifest and be revealed to us. But there are elements of Gnosticism within the conspiracy world. It's like, I know this one thing that you don't know about this big thing that happened, but you're a sheep. So, but I know what really happened, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Romanticism, though, something that I was not as familiar with. There's a great section in here that I want to read because I had this underlined, highlighted, starred, and everything. More romantic personalities make a habit of alarmed thinking. They begin to exaggerate the significance of actual experience, seeing the simple kindness of some as true love and minor conflicts as existential threats. They cast themselves as characters in a drama, assuming the role of heroic protagonist or tragic victim. As heroic protagonists, they take on the world as tragic victims. They destroy themselves spiritually, if not physically. There is no place for truth in such a mind. That's powerful. What is Romanticism? And sort of give your thoughts on what I just read and you wrote.
Well, it's just kind of an odd thing because it's very modern. What we really think of, but we often don't think of it because it's so much a part of the modern life there. But feelings, emotions were something that the ancient world knew were dangerous. And in a world where rulers, even members of your family, could have extreme control over you, you had to be very careful about who you offended. And so they realized you just couldn't let anger run its course. Oh, and then of course, the whole idea of the loving emotion or eroticism or eros, as the Greeks would call it, love for a man or a woman. Well, that was dangerous too, because, there was pregnancy and that's dangerous. It could mean death for the woman. And of course, depending upon who you're loving, you might run afoul of some other interest and threaten your life. And of course, the Trojan War starts over that. And so the ancients understood that emotions are not to be trusted, must be controlled. Yes, we have them, but it's not the basis of right and wrong. But the modern world, largely as a result of, you might say, an overage or an overemphasis on reason in the Enlightenment, And then the general mechanization of society that results from that, the industrial age. Modern Westerners rebelled against this overly rational view of things. Empirical or rational, those not the same thing, but they oftentimes go together to create the Industrial Revolution and all the technological achievements we have there. And so you had this desire for real feeling, something more human, and so they resort to believing in the emotions as actually inspirations, things that give you insight into reality. And so the poet comes to be your seer, your prophet. He's the one who communes with God through his poetry, and then he conveys that to us. And then, of course, you have the romantic novels that come up, which tell stories of great passion and devotion, which is built into this overblown example of just how people are to live their lives. And this has very destructive effects because people then start expecting their own life to read like a romance novel,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
or they start interpreting their own misery to read like a tragedy in a novel. And Goethe writes a novel about Dr. Werther. I can't remember the full title, but it's something like The Unfortunate Life of Dr. Werther. And he's this young man who really feels like he's misunderstood and ultimately ends up committing suicide. Well, it created a fashion in Europe of young men thinking they were understood, dressing like Dr. Werther, and then committing suicide. It has that effect as well. But it's grossly distorted our understanding of reality. And of course, only magnified with the advent of movies, television, and then now online, everything's so visual, everything's so imaginary, the virtual universe and what. It's all a matter of stimulating certain parts of our brains. They're all about feelings. And we just make that we're so driven by our feelings then that we cannot think straight about anything. We don't even have patience to sit and think through difficult issues or to analyze our experiences with any sense of reason or reflection. We just stimulate ourselves to death. It's like entertaining yourself to death while we're stimulating those emotions and just living accordingly. And it becomes the only thing that matters. And of course, that's what you see just coming out in a rage by the transgenderism business, is that these are people who are just driven by their emotions, driven to insanity, and intent on forcing everyone else to go along with it and attacking those who don't. So,
have you ever heard of a thing called main character syndrome?
Yes. It's where you cast yourself in the role of the protagonist. And we all do that to some degree.
Yes.
Some more than others. And I have to say is that in writing those words that you just quoted, I'm really thinking about my own upbringing, mm-hmm. and how at a certain age, I was very much into romantic music, both the classical or 19th century romantic music, but also modern romantic music, and spent a lot of time stimulating my emotions by listening to these both of these forms of music. And yes, you can get into thinking that you're the center of the universe, or you're the one that matters, you're the one that's right, and it's all about you. And we recognize how obviously wrong this is in others, but it's something you do see people when they act up like that. When we do it, we don't recognize it, but when we see other people do it, well, it should be a reminder to us that no, it's not all about you, and no, just because, well, the guy cut you off, that's not a threat to your life and limb, and so you didn't need to escalate. Okay, cut you off, and well, that's it. And so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anarchism, something a little bit more familiar to me with my political background. And it says, you say in here, the modern age might well be called the age of anarchy.
Right.
I think I could see some people I know, maybe in the boomer generation, going, "Wait, what? No, we are not. This is not anarchy. What I've been growing up in. How so?"
Those are words originally written in 8 Ways to Run a Country, because I was analyzing political philosophy from the standpoint of this concept of arche, distinguishing arche or arche, the Greek word, and kratos, which is a Greek word for force. And what arche, as I define it in that book, is a recognition of rank. Theologically, I'd say is also the source of being, because arche literally means beginning in Greek. And it's because of that sense of beginning that it then is also used in political ways, like monarchs and oligarchs and what. But originally, it's this idea that you owe your being to somebody else. You have to look up to people and you have to follow them and what. But this is exactly what's scandalous into the modern society, is they can't accept this. Again, this is Rousseau just rebelling against it. And what I say about the beginning of the age of anarchy, well, it begins with the Reformation, because it is, in a sense, a rebellion against hierarchy, which means the rule of priests, the church. And then it ultimately evolves into a rebellion against monarchy, the rule of kings. And then in our own day, it culminates with a rebellion against patriarchy, the rule of fathers, of men generally, and of fathers, and of God the Father. Ultimately, it's this idea of the creature insisting that no, he doesn't owe anything to the Creator. We don't owe anything to anyone else. We should be completely free to live as we please, which we see having reached its most extreme, most absurd proportions here in our own age. But it's been going on for a long time, and it's what explains the whole LGBTQ thing, and really it's the FLGBTQ thing, because the feminists were the first ones basically say male and female doesn't matter. They're the first gender theorists who deny this difference of male and female. But that's just the feminine expression of the Rousseauian idea that man was born free and is everywhere in chains, and what we need to do is throw off those chains. Marxism is another development of that. So Rousseauianism, Marxism, and then feminism, this is all just a steady movement in the same direction on the same basic principle. It's fundamentally selfish. You could say it's fundamentally satanic, because that's what Satan does. That's why, he's a creature, but he rebels against his creator. And well, there you go. That's, the first time that happens is the first anarchy. So that's there. And applied to truth, what it is that you just interpret everything from this idea of the oppressed. It's like, somebody's done me wrong and they need to pay for it. And that can terribly corrupt your understanding of right and wrong, because you will see everything through that lens. You'll always tend to think that I should have been allowed to do what I wanted, even when, of course, you have no real right to. And, it's a temptation against humility. That's the humility that's required to admit that you're not the basis of right and wrong. You're not the basis of the truth. You have to be humble enough to admit that other people matter, and ultimately, the source of it all is the source of all good, and what is good and true for all of us is that ultimate reality of God, and that's what. And the anarchist doesn't want to admit. They don't like that idea of submitting to anyone. And that's unfortunate, because obviously you're going to have a real problem with truth then.
We've got some new shirts, Counterflow with Buck Johnson on the front pocket, on the back. A beautiful graphic with, of course, dissident voices and unapproved opinions. You can see this on the YouTube version of the show, of course. We're putting the graphic up now. $30 flat fee. $30 gets you the t-shirt. The PayPal address is buck@counterflowpodcast.com. That is my PayPal. You can send $30 that method. Send me your address and the size you want. We have sizes small through 2XL. Again, sizes small through 2XL. Go to PayPal, $30, buck@counterflowpodcast.com. Give me your address in there and the t-shirt will be yours. Yes. A lot of this stuff sort of seems like tricks by the devil that could lead into the word that we're about to discuss, nihilism. And just from what I've seen, people I know personally, my former self, ignoring truth, being completely subjective, living for only you can and often does lead to a sort of emptiness, nihilism. And so I want to talk about that, because I think a lot of what we're discussing can lead to this sort of the spirit of nihilism.
Right. Interesting thing is, you were saying this, I've never made this point about nihilism before, but just as you were talking about it, it's in others that we find a reason for living. I lost my wife a year ago, and I was attended a memorial service for someone else's mother last night, and then a funeral today for a friend of mine. And I had to, in talking with someone after the funeral, I offered that they were talking about losing a spouse. And I have to say, it's like you lose a lot of your sort of reason for living at that point, of what you're accustomed to thinking of. And it occurs in the simplest ways. When you wake up in the morning and you realize there's nobody here that I need to get up for. Whereas before, she was always there and her life was dear to me. And I was a part of her life and had to be that part. So I had a reason to get out of bed every morning. Couldn't sleep in. And that's really what makes life meaningful, is this awareness of others and a commitment to others. But how to explain that, rationally? Well, nihilism it ultimately arises out of the subjectivism of Western philosophy. The actual term was first used by Jacobi, who is a Christian German, Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi. The first two names I'm a little rough on. They might be Heinrich Friedrich, but and Jacobi uses it as a bad thing, and he says it ultimately this is where the philosophy of Spinoza and Kant will lead, is to nihilism, because subjectivism, which is looking at everything from your own perspective, essentially denying that you can really know anything about the objective world. That's subjectivism. It's all just your own perception of things. It's all about perceptions, because as Kant says, you can't really know things in themselves. You can only know how they appear to you. And he says this will lead to nihilism. This will lead to ultimately a disbelief in all assertions of truth, which is exactly what it does. Unfortunately, it gets to be held up as this is just the only thing we can do because it's not possible to know anything. People just buy the subjectivist argument. And then nihilism is used as an excuse to free themselves from having to live according to any recognition of what is true. Mm-hmm. And then that frees each of us to try to be the Übermensch, the Superman. We're talking Nietzsche now. And Nietzsche is the great prophet of nihilism, although he did not originate the term. And almost a century early, Jacobi had recognized the danger he presents. But what it does present, it gives people who don't believe and want to just make their way as best as possible in the world an excuse for not paying attention to any assertions of truth that aren't convenient for them. And that's what people do. They'll say, well, what is truth? That's what Pilate says. Of course, he believes in some truths and he'll live that way. That nihilists are never consistent because they all do actually think that some things matter, some things are of value. And yet nihilism basically says, no, you can't figure it out. It's all just a personal perception, which is as much as say an illusion. And of course, until recently, while it was seen as a bad thing, it did lead to very murderous crime, people not believing in things. Now, as I point out in the book, there is a lot of people in the West have fallen into what some have called cheerful nihilism, which is, I think, well expressed in something like Forrest Gump, where you have this idea that life is just a box of chocolates. Some's good, some's bad. Oh, what are you going to do about it? Doesn't go beyond that. There's no meaning beyond that. It's like, it's a mix of things. And yet, even in an expression like that, you do have some real awareness of what is truly good, but no real obligation to respect it, because nihilism doesn't provide you with that.
Mm-hmm. Tribalism. This is a big one. You say the oldest and greatest enemy of truth. It is selfishness. For truth, by definition, depends on something outside of the self. When one stops believing in truth, one starts believing only in the self and its desires. The self itself becomes the only truth and the only existence that matters, the only reality that counts, and thus the measure of all things. That's also beautifully stated. And I want to talk about tribalism. And also, you alluded to it earlier. We can get into it here a little bit. But the two ways to read, Hebrew history based on sort of, tribalism in a way, and then Christianity in the other way.
Yeah, tribalism, and oftentimes, of course, and I do in the book point that ultimately at the core of it is this idea of basing everything on the self, totally selfish. But of course, most people recognize that their own good is related to the good of others, and so it's commonly expanded to a group of people, the tribe, me and mine. It's all about me and mine. And that is a common human temptation. We all fall into that. We all tend to think as ourselves as good and the other people as being bad. And nowadays it's like, this is a problem. It's always been a problem with American foreign policy. Is we assume that when Americans go abroad, they go abroad just like us, and we're good. And so American foreign policy is good.
Yes.
And we tend to dismiss the legitimate interests of other peoples and believe that they're just bad. And of course, that feeds into so many wars. World War I, it was the Germans, the Krauts, or whatever we want to call it, the Bosch. There were all kinds of names for them. And World War II, that came up again. Oh, and you also had the Nips, the Japanese. And this is not to say that there weren't great crimes committed by both of those countries. Both of those nations under the rulers that they had who were behind a lot of these things. But nevertheless, we did only natural for people to project this evil on other people, to externalize evil. And nowadays, I think it's part of the problem with our dealings with Russia is because Americans we think we're good and the Russians are just bad. And there are plenty of other tribes that have an interest in depicting the Russians as bad. You have Poles, you have Latvians, you have Ukrainians, and you also have Jews who, many of them Russian background, and they all have a beef against the Russians for one reason or another. And that's a problem with foreign policy because you do get lobbyists from foreign countries that are really more interested in the foreign country than they are in the United States. Lots of them here in town. They've got a lot of them have their ethnic lobbies, and some of them heard and some of them don't get heard. And yes, and when it comes to reading the Old Testament, that's one issue. It is, actually a lot of right-thinking people don't read it rightly, because if you read it, there's an awful lot in there about the tribe and about keeping the tribe separate. And the tribe is allowed to do things at times, dealing with the Canaanites, for instance, that, that doesn't sound nice. That doesn't sound good and loving. Go in there and slaughter everything. Well, the only way to really understand these things, other than a license for the tribe to do that, and that's what, of course, some people are concerned about now, is that, Israel is struggling for its survival, and so it just seems to have thrown off in limits on what it does, behaving just like the Israelites when they first came to the region. And not to say that that's good, but that's one way you could read the Old Testament. But the other way is to read it from the standpoint of really what the tribe was supposed to always be about. And that is, again, that faith, that trust in God, that humbleness of Jacob, who he realizes, and it's sort of a sorry story because up until the point where he demonstrates this really good thing, does this really good thing, first exceptionally good thing anyone in the Old Testament does. Up until that point, he's done a lot of wrong things, actually. He and his mother and his uncle and his wives, they all behave rather badly. And then you have Jacob sort of at a loss for what to do. And God tells him to go back to the land of his fathers, which means going back and dealing with Esau, the brother he's cheated repeatedly. And Esau wants him dead, but he does it, and he risks all that he has, sending it across the river. He sends all his goods, all his flocks, all his herds across the river with servants, and says, presents some of them to Esau as a gift to see if that'll appease him. calm him down. And eventually, he knows Esau still wants him dead, but he sends it all over. He ultimately sends his own family over, but he stays on the far side of the Jordan. And then that's when he wrestles with the angel of God, the man. It says a man appeared to him, and he wrestles with the man, and he almost gets the better of the man. And that's when he's given this new name. He asks the name of the man, and the man says, "You're asking me my name? I'll give you a new name, and it shall be Israel," which means he who wrestles with God, which I interpret to mean, and this is close to the conventional interpretation, that he who rivals God, or he who does something godlike, in a sense, by being willing, humble enough, and good-willing enough towards his brother to risk all that he has to make peace with his brother there. And that's when you have that's the example. That's how I think the model, the reason why is that the word Israel is so deeply meaningful in Christian understanding. But that's not how, in a sense, Jews understand it. Is that all along their emphasis on things like circumcision, the laws of Moses that they're compelled to live by. This is all a way of, in a sense, maintaining the tribe and keeping other people out. They're not interested in making converts of others. Whereas I think if you did it from the Christian standpoint, that there was some practical need indeed for the people of God to indeed avoid compromising their own faith by embracing the world and accepting everybody and then living according to the Canaanite values and whatnot. So they did have to be careful about that. But ultimately, it was all about people of faith. And the prophecies, of course, include that eventually other peoples will come into this. Others will be added to the fold. And then, as our Lord said, there shall be one fold and one shepherd. And that's in the prophecies. It's even in the prophecies that this people of God will receive a new name. Will no longer be the people of Israel, but rather what we would call today Christians. That's the new name.
All right. We don't have much time, but towards the end of the book, you discuss Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity. And I sort of want to hit those as we're in our final minutes of this episode. And sort of, because again, my truth, we're all worshiping the same God. It's all leading up, it's different trails going up the same mountain. We've all heard all of these things. And I sort of want to put an end to some of this for the people that are, in search of truth. And so could we talk, again, as we close this out, we'll get into these and how their relationship with the truth, what is actually different from Orthodox Christianity. And we can start with Islam.
Islam is a sort of easy one because they do have a very different conception of God. And though, of course, we could all agree, there's just one supreme being, but how you think of him makes all the difference. And Islam is that Islam is really the only objective reality you're obliged to respect is Allah. And so you're not obliged to respect any reality concerning others. What Allah wants is simply submission to him. He's the definition of truth. He's what's good and true. And so since he's the only basis of right and wrong, of what is true, just, and he doesn't do what Christ does, it's a case where if Allah is good, then if Allah is God, then if all, we put that aside there. Christ, Allah doesn't live up to his own standard of goodness. He doesn't do what he expects from Muslims there. He expects Muslims to live and die for him. He doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, Allah is not good. He's just Allah. And he does even actually permit Muslims to deceive people. They have a doctrine of taqiyya, which allows Muslims to make treaties that they intend to break when it's to the advantage of the Muslim people of the faith. They also, it's okay to use force, violence, in order to obtain the subjugation of other peoples. It's also, and to obtain submission, so you can threaten people with death. And this is part of it in the Quran, but also in the life of Muhammad, which is a key Muslim text from the early centuries, where it tells of Muhammad himself threatening people with conversion. If they don't convert, he'll lay their heads at their feet. And that's the words are used. So yeah, they don't have the definition. They don't really have the respect for truth that Christianity has. Mm-hmm. You're allowed to lie. That's as long as it's in the cause of Allah, which is what jihad's all about: struggling, striving in the cause of Allah.
And Judaism.
Judaism is in many ways like Islam because they're both religions of law. But in Judaism, you get, and I would, the way I talk about these in the book, I'd say if, in a sense, an opposite of Islam is not Judaism, but Buddhism. Buddhism is very much an opposite, where you don't have an objective reality that demands submission. You have the universe, and you're just a part of the universe, and as a result, you don't really have any strong commitment to how you perceive the universe. It's all really just a religion of avoiding suffering. And so you're not called to serve anything because the universe is just the universe. And this is quite the opposite of Islam. But Judaism is really almost the opposite of Christianity. And I quote some Jews saying that actually in the book. So it's not something I make up. Jews are a little more perceptive of the differences between Jews and Christians than Christians are typically, because they live in a world where a lot of people are Christians and most Christians don't. Most Christians don't have a whole lot of contact with Jews. But with Jews, you clearly have this focus on the tribe. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not for many of them. In fact, the surveys show that the last survey, and this is from 20 years ago, I doubt that's changed much, but at least half of the Jews in America don't believe in God. Many of them do, however, still believe in being Jewish and identifying with the Jewish people and living for that. And that's, in effect, how it's defined by one of the Jews that I quote in that section there, is that he defines Judaism or being a Jew as identifying with the Jewish people and caring for their good, their well-being. And what it results in is a very narrow view of right and wrong that is really all about what's good for the Jews. And anything that's not good for the Jews, well, that's just definitionally anti-Semitic. And that's where we've gotten to today. It's really rather shocking, and of course, it's coming up online now, especially with Tucker Carlson's interview with Nick Fuentes. But there's several other people. It's the worst kept secret. This is not my saying, but it's the worst kept secret in Washington is the influence of the Israeli lobby. But it's clear there that there are some people who are really just more interested in the good of the Jews in Israel, and they're just not bound by any rule that says you have to be truthful about these things. You have to be fair about these things. And unfortunately, they've been able to corral an awful lot of non-Jews into going along with their very ambitious American foreign policy because it's necessary in order to sustain the protection of Israel as it is today. They need the funding, they need the protection, and we're the only superpower they've got left, really. Only superpower they've ever had. But that's a problem. But it clearly means that there's just not. They too, and the Talmud gives examples of how you can deceive people. It's okay. You can deceive Gentiles. There are times for that. And a great Jewish philosopher named Maimonides wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. And it's built on Platonism. Platonism also takes this view is that you can't expect everybody to be able to handle the truth. And so you have to cultivate the truth in a small group of people and then tell other people, the masses, the hoi polloi, which means the many, tell them something else. And it's there in Plato, in Platonists, it's there in Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher from 500, 600 or so years ago. And it's also there in a more recent Jewish philosopher named Leo Strauss, who talked about the city in speech, which is the things you tell the public, but you don't necessarily believe yourself. And you tell you and your group other things. So it's a fundamental, just upside down in terms of what Christianity teaches, is that we really do want to share the truth with everyone. Be cautious about that and smart about it, but nevertheless, that's what we're about, is living for the truth, dying for it if necessary.
Yeah, well said. Any closing things you'd like to speak on as far as anything we've talked about, the book, etc.?
Just that I really do believe that everybody will get something out of it. And as I say, I wrote it for my own teenagers, that when they read it, they would at least know that a good case can be made, and it would be a case directly relevant to the choices they make in their lives. So it's not just a case of proving that Christ lived in the first century and died and whatnot. It's about how essential it is that if you believe in truth, then you really need to believe in the Christian kind of God, who will reward you for living according to truth, because it doesn't really make rational sense for you to insist on truth and suffer and die for it. When you're dead, you're dead. If that's all there is. At the same time, if you believe in Christ, then you really have to believe in truth, and you can't believe in just doing your best to hide the truth from people, being nice to people. As I say, you can't trick people into truth or love them with lies. You have to give people the truth, because that's where the hope is. This hope of the resurrection is all focused on the resurrection, which is not about life, is not about living well in this life. It's about getting to the other life where we really will live well forever.
Is Amazon the best place in your mind for people to find this?
It's actually the only place.
Okay.
Published through Amazon's KDP. Yeah.
Got it.
So, yeah.
Well, that makes that easy.
The publisher is Basilian Media. And I don't know if they have a website that sells it, but you can easily buy it online as well from Amazon.
Wonderful. Christ as truth, truth as Christ. I wanted to show it one more time here on the screen. Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell, thank you so much for being here once again and going over this. And I highly recommend this for people. So thank you, sir.
Great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. God bless.
All right. Hope you guys got something out of that. I know you did. I know you had to get something out of that. It was a great interview. Thank you again, Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell. And next week, you guys, someone I had the chance to chat with briefly last time I saw Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell up in Virginia. Vladika Metropolitan Jonah will be our guest next week. That's going to be a fun one. For this show, subscribe on the YouTube channel. That helps us in the algorithms. Like, comment, all of that stuff. You sort of know the drill. You can follow me on X at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. You can follow my new Substack. I'm not good at pitching myself. So if you're on Substack, find Counterflow with Buck Johnson, hit follow. You'll find me. You guys know how to do that better than I do, but I wrote a piece last month. I plan to continue writing some Substacks for you guys. And until next week, you guys have a good one. Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.